let me share my views of some of the books about Lucknow. This is essentially a book club, or about Awadh, is from Ayodhya. So the first book which comes to my mind when we talk about Awadh is actually Ramcharitmanas. Very often we say Awadh and the Nawabi Awadh as almost the same, but there is a substratum of this hinterland which was there much before the Nawabs and the Mughals came. So the first great piece of literature which I associate with Awadh is Ramcharitmanas, although strictly speaking it might not have been written within the territorial boundaries of Awadh, but culturally definitely it is inspired from Ayodhya. The second medieval piece of literature would be Padmavat. Padmavat is a story which is based on Chittorgarh, but it is basically written by Malik Muhammad Jaisi, who belonged to Jais. Jais is a small kasbah or a town between Raebareli and Lucknow. Then in the 18th century, Lucknow transformed from a suba of a Mughal empire to a very important provincial capital in its own right when the Awadh Nawabs became almost independent rulers and their capital shifted from Faizabad to Lucknow. This was the time when the Mughal dynasty was in the decline. Many poets and literary figures, along with musicians, artists, artisans, were shifting their base to Awadh. There was a efflorescence of Urdu poetry in the Lucknow Awadh region. Mir Taki Mir, Sauda, Mir Anis, they came and made Lucknow their home. This great tradition of Urdu poetry continued in Lucknow and Awadh and has continued till date. So from Mir Taki Mir and Sauda, we came to other great like Majaz and Ali Sardar Jafris, to Janisar Akhtars, and even today to Javed Akhtar. But along with that, we also see in the late 19th century a plethora of Urdu prose. Probably the two most important Urdu writers of Awadh, I would say, is Ismat Chugtai and Qurratan al-Haidar. Of people who would like to read any of these, I would say this book, Chandni Begum of Qurratan al-Haidar, is probably one book which can take you to the Lucknow of that time. I would also definitely go for this book. This is a memoir of Josh Malihabadi, the famous poet from Awadh. But this is a wonderful book called Yadon Ki Barat. Yadon Ki Barat is the autobiography and memoir of Josh Saab. And anybody who is interested in Awadh of that era, of the late 19th century, early 20th century, must read this book. One of the greatest novels in Urdu prose is Umrao Jan, which has been so beautifully captured on screen by Muzaffar Ali Saab. And many would have seen the film, but many would not have probably read the book. That is another book which is worth reading. But along with this Urdu prose, there were three Hindi writers who made Lucknow their home. And these three writers, I would say, is Amritlal Nagar, Vrindavanlal Verma, and Yashpal. Even today, if you travel from the Gol Market area and you go past the Ritz Sweet House, on the Tri-Junction, you see Yashpal's house, with Yashpal's name written on the marble plaque. In any other country, probably this would have been a museum. So Yashpal's Jhuta Sach, although it is not set in Lucknow, is one of the greatest novels of 20th century Hindi literature. But along with this Hindi and Urdu literature, there was another stream. And this stream was the literature produced by the colonial writers, the British writers. These writers were traveling through Lucknow, often writing their memoirs, like W. Sleeman, the Suleiman Saab of Shatranj Ke Khiladi, who wrote his wonderful memoirs of travels of Lucknow. But there is also a number of diaries written by the ladies who were sufferers in the siege of Lucknow of 1857. So after 1857, you see a number of such diaries written by British ladies. English wife, for example. Then there is a remarkable book which came in around early part of the 20th century, and I would say this is a seminal book on Lucknow. This is a book which Jayant will talk about, is Abdul Halim Sharar's Guzishta Lucknow, which was translated into English and came out in 1975 as Lucknow, the Last Phase of Oriental Culture. It is my guess that since this book came out in 1975, there was a reignition of the curiosity about Lucknow. And so many other people like Rosie Lilwyn Jones, uh, Veena Oldenburg Talwar, and Violet Graf wrote about Lucknow and came out with a series of books on Lucknow. For people who are interested, I would say this book, Violet Graf's Memories of a City, is a wonderful collection of essays on Lucknow written by different authors. So it not only gives in one book a number of interesting facets of Lucknow, but also introduces you to different writers who have written on Lucknow over a period of time. In the last 20 years or so, there has been a lot of writings about Lucknow, and I think only Delhi and Calcutta have surpassed in the quantity and quality of writings that has been in Lucknow. There has been less fiction on Lucknow. Parveen Talhaji, who has also joined us today, has written a number of beautiful short stories called Fida Lucknow, which is English short stories based in contemporary Lucknow. Mehru Zafar has written a wonderful book called Love and Life in Lucknow, which I don't know whether it's anecdotal or short story, but it kind of crosses the boundary between the two. The favorite book on Lucknow, the fiction book that I have read, is this delightful book called Sunlight on a Broken Column by Atiya Hussain. This is a novel that I think anybody who is interested in Lucknow should read. This is a delightful novel and is a very peculiarly complex and beautiful novel because it shows how the Lucknow society was changing. The feudal or the Talukadar families were changing in the light of the socialist nationalist winds that were blowing in the mid part of the 20th century in independence movement. It also showed how a Lucknow woman brought up in a genteel family of Awadh was getting transformed and getting now educated, and the forces that were playing inside her own mind and her own psyche when she was getting exposed to the outer world. So it shows Lucknow in a beautiful phase of its time when it was getting transformed in many different ways. It is not a very structured novel, and many would say its end is very abrupt. I think its end is a bit abrupt, but it is a beautiful novel set in the Lucknow of the mid 20th century. Atiya Hussain never lived in independent India's Lucknow. She lived in British Lucknow, and then she was stuck in London when India got independence and partition happened, and she never came back to Lucknow. I was so fascinated with this book that I once went searching for this bungalow where Atiya Hussain has picturized this novel and where she grew up. And this building still stands today. It stands just beyond the State Cooperative Bank in the heart of Hazratganj. There's a small house just next to the State Cooperative Bank, and one can go and see that, but it evokes memories if you have read this novel. So that I would say is my favorite novel. But the first novel that really inspired me about Lucknow, when I had nothing to do with Lucknow, I had not come to Lucknow even, was The Emperor's Ring. Emperor's Ring is a novella which is written in Bangla called Badshahi Anki by Satyajit Ray. It is the first novel of Feluda. And that was the novel which actually introduced me to Lucknow, to Bhul Bhulaiya, to Bada Imam Bada, and to Wajid Ali Shah and his Tumris.